The blade was a sliver of moonlight arcing toward her throat when his hand, colder than the grave, clamped around the assassin's wrist. He hadn't meant to intervene. The mousy librarian was beneath his notice. But as her terrified, wide-eyed gaze met his, a force like a lightning strike seared through him, a bond he had believed a myth snapping into place with agonizing certainty. He was Lord Alistair Valerius, ancient and indomitable, and the woman cowering in the filthy London alley, the very same creature he had publicly humiliated hours before, was his fated mate. The irony was a poison more potent than any hunter's stake. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected alliances or awakened powers, subscribe and join our circle. The game is about to change. Now, back to the scene. The sound of bones crunching was sickeningly loud in the narrow passage, a wet, percussive crack that echoed off the grimy brickwork. Alistair didn't even look at the man whose wrist he'd just obliterated. His entire being was focused on the searing, unwelcome connection that now pulsed between him and the woman. Her scent, a delicate and infuriating blend of old paper, Earl Grey tea, and the rain-soaked wool of her cheap coat, was no longer a mild annoyance he could dismiss. It was a brand on his soul, a tether pulling taut, demanding a reverence he refused to give. He shoved the whimpering assassin away, the man's useless arm dangling, and the would-be killer scrambled backward into the shadows, disappearing with the haste of a rat fleeing a wolf. Alistair turned his full attention to her. Elara. He remembered her name now, a whisper from the library's head curator. She was still pressed against the wall, her hands flattened against the damp bricks, as if trying to merge with them. Her spectacles were askew, and a stray strand of mousy brown hair had escaped her severe bun, clinging to a cheek pale with terror. She was the picture of insignificance, a creature made of quiet gestures and whispered apologies. And she was, inexplicably, his. The fated mate. A legend whispered among his kind, a connection so rare it was considered a fairy tale, a weakness a true predator could not afford. "You," he snarled, the word a plume of frosted air in the cold night. It was an accusation, a curse. Elara flinched, her eyes, the color of faded parchment behind her lenses, widening further. She couldn't speak. Her throat was a knot of pure fear. One moment she had been walking home, her mind still stinging from the public scorn of the handsome, cruel aristocrat who had visited the library that afternoon. The next, a man with a knife and the dead eyes of a shark had cornered her. And then, impossibly, the very same aristocrat had appeared from the shadows like a phantom, moving faster than sight, saving her with a casual brutality that was almost as terrifying as the initial attack. "What? Who are you?" she finally managed, her voice a reedy tremor. "I am the man whose afternoon you wasted with your trembling hands and maddening incompetence," he said, his voice laced with silken cruelty. He took a step closer, enjoying the way she shrank from him. He needed this distance, this fear. It was a shield against the tidal wave of protective instinct the bond was forcing upon him. He wanted to straighten her spectacles, to brush the stray hair from her face, to wrap her in his cloak and spirit her away from the filth of this alley. The desire was so foreign, so violently contrary to his nature, that it felt like a violation. So he fought it with the only weapons he had, scorn and intimidation. He remembered the scene at the Grand Library of the Athenaeum Club with perfect, cold clarity. He had been there for the Codex Nocturnus, a text so obscure it was barely a footnote in most catalogs. He'd known it was there, his sources were impeccable, but procuring it required navigating the labyrinth of human bureaucracy, a process he despised. And Alara had been the librarian on duty. She had fumbled with the key to the rare books room, her hands shaking under his impatient gaze. She had dropped a stack of index cards, her cheeks flushing a humiliating shade of crimson as she scrambled to pick them up, apologizing in a barely audible whisper. He, Lord Alastair Valerius, who commanded legions and whose name was a shadow over dynasties, had been forced to wait. His frustration had mounted until it overflowed. Look at her. His voice, a velvet whip, had lashed across the hushed silence of the grand reading room, turning every head. Afraid of her own shadow. They entrust treasures to a mouse who trembles if you turn a page too quickly. Is this the creature they say holds the keys to knowledge? The assembled scholars and nobles had chuckled, their sycophantic laughter echoing his own disdain. Alara had frozen, her face ashen, her humiliation absolute. He had felt a moment of cold satisfaction before dismissing her entirely from his mind. Until now, until this damnable bond erupted between them. My incompetence? She whispered, a flicker of indignation cutting through her fear. It was so faint he almost missed it, but it was there, a tiny spark in the tinder of her terror. You failed to retrieve a simple book, a task a trained monkey could accomplish, he sneered, moving closer still, pinning her with his gaze. His eyes were the color of a winter sky at dusk, ancient and utterly devoid of warmth. And because of your memorable ineptitude, my enemies now know I am searching for the codex. They saw me speak to you. They saw my displeasure. He spat the word. They deduced you were nothing to me, an insignificant librarian. An easy target to leave as a message. The pieces clicked into place in Ilara's mind, a horrifying mosaic of logic. The man with the knife wasn't a random cut-purse. He was a messenger. And the message was meant for this terrifying man standing before her. She was just the parchment it was to be written on. They were wrong, of course, Alastair continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous purr. He was so close now she could feel a strange cold radiating from him, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. You are not insignificant. Fate, in its infinite and pathetic capacity for irony, has seen to that. He reached out and she flinched violently, squeezing her eyes shut. But his touch, when it came, was surprisingly gentle. He didn't grab her. His gloved fingers simply brushed against the collar of her coat, a whisper of contact that sent a jolt, hot and electric, through her entire body, through him. He recoiled as if burned, his hand dropping to his side, his fist clenching. The bond pulsed. Mine. Protect. Cherish. The impulses were anathema. He fought them down, smothering them with centuries of practiced control. Here is the situation, librarian, he said, his tone flat and devoid of any emotion, a chilling contrast to the storm raging within him. You have, through no virtue of your own, become entangled in a game far older and more deadly than you can possibly imagine. My enemies will not stop. Now that their first attempt has failed, they will be more thorough. They will come for you again, and next time I may not be so conveniently placed to intervene. But why? She pleaded. I don't know anything. I'm a librarian. You are the librarian who touched the request slip for the Codex Nocturnus. You are the librarian who knows the book exists and where it is supposed to be. And you, he hesitated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, the woman who now has my attention. That makes you the most valuable and vulnerable piece on the board. He saw the fight drain out of her, replaced by a profound, soul-deep weariness. She was a pawn in a war she didn't know existed. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Here it was, the proposal. Not of marriage, not of courtship, but of imprisonment. He laid it out for her with the cold precision of a surgeon. "You will come with me. You will live in my house, under my protection. You will not leave. You will not speak to anyone from your former life. You will dedicate every waking moment to a single task, helping me find the true location of that codex. Your knowledge of library systems, of cataloging, of the history of collections, all of it now belongs to me." In exchange, he offered the sliver of hope that would ensure her compliance. "I will allow you to continue living." It was a monstrous proposition. He was kidnapping her, enslaving her. But he was also, in his own twisted way, offering her the only chance of survival she had. The alternative was a bloody end in a dark alley at the hands of those who hunted him. Ilara stared at him, her mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It was a nightmare, a gothic fantasy novel come to life. But the cold seeping into her bones and the lingering stench of fear in the air were undeniably real. She looked at his face, at the perfect, aristocratic features that seemed carved from marble, and saw no room for negotiation in his twilight eyes. He was not asking, he was commanding. She thought of her small, lonely flat, the stack of books by her bed, the quiet, predictable rhythm of her life. It was a meager existence, but it was hers. He was asking her to surrender it completely. Yet the memory of the blade at her throat, the chilling emptiness in the first attacker's eyes, was still fresh. Her survival instinct, a thing she barely knew she possessed, made the decision for her. With a barely perceptible nod, a gesture of pure defeat, she acquiesced. I will go with you." A flicker of something, not relief, perhaps satisfaction, crossed his features before being suppressed. "A wise choice, librarian," he said. He turned and began to walk toward the mouth of the alley, his long, dark coat swirling around him. He didn't look back, confident she would follow. He was a predator, and she, the prey, was now bound to him. Ilara took a shaky breath, pushed herself off the wall, and adjusted her crooked spectacles. With one last, longing glance at the distant gas-lit street that represented the world she was leaving behind, she followed the dark figure, stepping out of the shadows and into a deeper, more permanent darkness. Her life as a shy, invisible librarian was over. A new, terrifying chapter had begun, and its author was the very monster who had just saved her life, only to claim it as his own. Valerius Manor was not a house. It was a fortress of Gothic splendor, a shard of night given architectural form. It loomed over the city from its perch on Highgate Hill, a collection of spires, gargoyles, and stained-glass windows that stared down at London like judgmental eyes. For Ilara, it was the most beautiful prison she could ever have imagined. The first few days were a blur of disorientation and fear. Alistair installed her in a suite of rooms that was larger than her entire flat. It was filled with priceless antiques, a canopy bed draped in velvet, and, in a stroke of what she could only assume was unintentional cruelty, a magnificent private library. The shelves were stocked with first editions and priceless manuscripts that would have made the old Alara weep with joy. But she could find no comfort in them now. They were merely the gilded bars of her cage. Alistair was a ghost. He would appear without warning, his presence a sudden drop in temperature, to deliver stacks of arcane texts, maps, and historical records. He would give her curt instructions. Cross-reference the acquisition logs of the Bodleian Library from 1780 to 1820 with any mention of the Order of the Gloomwood, and then vanish, leaving her alone in the oppressive silence of the manor. He never spoke of the bond. He never touched her. He treated her with a cold, professional distance that was, in its own way, more unnerving than his initial hostility. It was as if he were trying to pretend that the cataclysmic event in the alley had never happened. But Ilara could feel it. It was a low hum beneath the surface of their interactions, a strange awareness of him even when he was rooms away. Sometimes, when she was deeply engrossed in a text, she would feel a sudden, inexplicable wave of frustration or melancholy. And minutes later, she would hear the distant sound of something shattering in Alistair's study. His emotions, it seemed, were bleeding into her. She fought back her fear by retreating into the work. It was the one thing she knew, the one area where she was not incompetent. She was a brilliant researcher, a prodigy of the archival sciences. Her shyness was a social affliction. In the world of books, she was a queen. She began to piece together the history of the Codex Nocturnus, not as a magical artifact, but as a physical object that had been bought, sold, stolen, and hidden over centuries. One evening, nearly a week into her captivity, she made a breakthrough. She was in the manor's main library, a cavernous two-story room where the air smelled of leather and dust. Alistair was there, standing before the massive stone fireplace, staring into the flames. He thought she was merely reading, but she was watching his reflection in the dark glass of a display case. The codex wasn't stolen from the Cluny Abbey in 1588, she said, her voice clear and steady, breaking the long silence. Alistair didn't turn. The historical records are quite clear on that point. "The records are wrong," she insisted, emboldened by her certainty. "They say the entire collection of heretical texts was seized and burned, but the Abbey's own private ledger, which was miscatalogued as a book of psalms, tells a different story. The abbot traded the codex to a Venetian merchant for 3 casks of communion wine and a relic of questionable authenticity." She slid the fragile ledger across the vast mahogany table. The merchant's name was Silvano, and his family crest, described here, matches the watermark on a series of letters donated to the British Museum 2 centuries later. For the first time, Alistair turned to look at her fully. He walked to the table, his movements silent and fluid. He picked up the ledger, his long, pale fingers tracing the faded script. The hum of the bond between them intensified, and with it, Ilara felt a wave of something that shocked her. Grudging admiration. It was his, directed at her. "Impressive, librarian," he said, his voice devoid of its usual mockery. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw a flicker of something ancient and weary in his eyes. "You see the threads others miss." "It's my job," she said quietly, her heart hammering in her chest. "It is your gift," he corrected her. That single, simple acknowledgement was more potent than any threat or command. It was a crack in the formidable armor he wore. For a fleeting moment, he wasn't a monster, and she wasn't his prisoner. They were 2 scholars, 2 seekers of a hidden truth, united in a common purpose. The moment passed as quickly as it came. He straightened up, his face once again an unreadable mask. The Silvano family was absorbed by the Medici. Their archives are in Florence. I will make arrangements," he said, and swept from the room, leaving her with the ghost of his praise and the undeniable thrum of their connection. The dynamic between them began to shift, slowly, almost imperceptibly. Their work sessions became less about commands and more like debates. Ilara, finding her footing, would challenge his assumptions, pointing out historical inconsistencies in his plans. Alistair, in turn, began to treat her less like a tool and more like a colleague, a highly valuable, deeply irritating colleague with whom he was inexplicably bound. One night, the manor was attacked. It was not a single assassin this time, but a team of hunters, professionals armed with silver blades and crossbows. The alarm runes Alistair had carved into the stones of the manor blazed with blue light as the attackers breached the outer walls. Alistair appeared in her room in an instant, moving from the hallway to her side in the space of a heartbeat. He wasn't wearing his tailored coat, but a simple black shirt that did little to hide the raw power in his form. "Stay here. Do not open this door for anyone but me," he commanded, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "What's happening?" she cried, her voice trembling. "My rivals are impatient," he said. Before she could react, he reached out and cupped her cheek. His skin was cold, but the touch was electric, and the protective urge that radiated from him was so powerful it was almost a physical blow. It flooded her senses, a primal declaration that stunned her into silence. Mine, safe. He was gone before she could draw breath. For the next hour, the sounds of battle echoed through the stone halls, the clash of steel, splintering wood, and guttural shouts. Ilara huddled in her room, terrified not just for herself, but, to her own astonishment, for him. The bond was a two-way street. She could feel the cold fury of his fight, the sting of a silver-laced cut to his arm, his unyielding determination. When he finally returned, he was splattered with dust and something dark that wasn't his own blood. There was a long, shallow gash on his forearm that was already beginning to heal, the skin knitting itself back together before her eyes. "It is done," he said, his breathing perfectly even. She rushed forward without thinking. "You're hurt!" She reached for his arm. "It is nothing," he said, pulling away as if her touch would burn him. The rejection stung. "They almost got to you," she whispered, staring at the rapidly closing wound. "They were never a threat to me," he said with chilling arrogance. "They were a threat to you. They were a distraction, trying to draw me away from you." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "And they succeeded." Her blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "While I was dispatching the fools in the garden, one of them made it inside. Not to fight me, to leave something." He stepped aside. On the floor of her library, placed neatly in the center of an expensive rug, was a single, withered black rose. "A symbol of the Coven of the Thorn," Alistair explained, his voice grim. "My chief rival, Lord Malachi. He is telling me he can get to you whenever he wishes, that my fortress is meaningless, that you are my weakness." Ilara stared at the dead flower, and for the first time she understood the true extent of her peril. She was not just a pawn anymore. She was the prize, the target, the soft spot in the armor of an immortal warrior. "What do we do?" she asked, looking up at him. She was no longer just his prisoner. She was his ally, whether either of them liked it or not. Alistair looked from the rose to her face, and a profound change settled in his expression. The centuries of solitude and command warred with the raw, undeniable pull of the bond. He had built his entire existence on the principle of solitary strength, of being untouchable. This woman, this shy, intelligent, fragile human, had shattered that foundation without even trying. Protecting her was no longer a matter of self-preservation to avoid the agony of a broken mate bond. It had become an imperative in its own right. "We go on the offensive," he said, his voice a low growl of promise. "We find the Codex before they do. And we end this." He looked at her, his partner in this deadly game. "And you, Librarian, are going to show me how." Their quest took them from the dusty archives in Florence to a forgotten monastery in the Swiss Alps. They traveled by night, Alistair's resources providing them with private trains and secluded carriages. The world Alara had known, a small 5-mile radius around her London flat, exploded into a continent of moonlit landscapes and ancient secrets. With every new city, every new library, her confidence grew. She was no longer the fumbling librarian who had trembled under Alistair's gaze. She moved with purpose, her arguments sharp, her insights brilliant. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his mood, the tightening of his jaw that signaled danger, the rare, almost imperceptible softening of his eyes when she uncovered another piece of the puzzle. Alistair, in turn, was forced to confront the depth of his connection to her. He found himself listening to her stories about her quiet childhood, her love for tales of adventure she had only ever read about. He started bringing her tea, a silent offering left on her desk while she worked. He'd find a rare edition of a book she'd mentioned loving and leave it for her to find. Small, human gestures that felt monumental coming from him. The bond between them was a constant presence, evolving from a painful shackle into a quiet, humming current of awareness. He was acutely conscious of her safety, his predatory senses always on high alert for any threat. She, in turn, felt the immense weight of his immortality, the loneliness that clung to him like a shroud. He was not just a monster, he was a tragic figure, a king on a throne of solitude. They were in Prague, in the labyrinthine cellars beneath the old Jewish cemetery, following a lead from the Silvano archives. The air was thick with the dust of ages and the faint scent of decay. Ilara held a lantern high, its light casting dancing shadows on the walls of earth and bone. "The text said it was hidden where the golem sleeps," she murmured, consulting a rubbing she'd taken from a Florentine manuscript. "It's a riddle. The golem of Prague is a legend." "Legends are merely history that has been forgotten," Alistair said, his eyes scanning the darkness. He was unnaturally still, a predator in his element. Suddenly, he put a hand on her arm, stopping her. "We are not alone." The attack came from all sides. They were not hunters this time, but something else. Creatures of shadow, with glowing eyes and claws that scraped against the stone. Malachi's foot soldiers. Alistair moved, a blur of controlled violence. He was magnificent and terrifying, a whirlwind of black cloth and deadly grace. But there were too many. As he fought, one of the creatures slipped past him, its eyes fixed on Ilara. She screamed, stumbling backward, the lantern falling from her hand and extinguishing, plunging them into near total darkness. She felt hot, foul breath on her face, saw the glint of claws. She braced for the end. But the blow never came. Alistair was there, his body shielding hers, an arm of steel wrapped around her. He took the creature's claws in his back, a guttural roar of pain and fury ripping from his throat. The sound was not human. It was the sound of a primal force unleashed. He dispatched the remaining creatures with a ferocity that stunned even Ilara. When it was over, they were left in the suffocating darkness, the only sound their own breathing. "Alistair," she whispered, her hands pressed against his chest. She could feel the torn fabric of his shirt, the warm, sticky wetness of his blood. "Are you—" "They are gone," he said, his voice strained. "Are you unharmed?" "Yes, because of you. You're bleeding." "It will heal," he said dismissively, but she could feel the tremors of pain running through his body. He had shielded her without a moment's hesitation. The action was so instinctive, so absolute, it left no room for doubt. In the dark, with the scent of his blood and the cold earth around them, the last of her fear of him vanished, replaced by something far more complicated. She reached up, her hand finding his face, her thumb tracing the sharp line of his jaw. He went rigid at her touch. "Ilara," he warned, his voice a low growl. She didn't retreat. "Why did you do that?" "You are my mate. The bond demands I protect you." The words were cold, clinical, but his body's reaction betrayed him. A shudder ran through him at her touch. "Is that all it is?" she whispered, her fingers moving to his hair, soft as silk. He didn't answer. Instead, he lowered his head, and in the pitch blackness of the ancient catacombs, his lips found hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision, a release of all the tension, fear, and frustrated longing that had simmered between them for weeks. It was the raw, desperate confession of a bond that had become more than just fate. It was a choice. His cold lips were a shock against hers, but the kiss was searingly hot, full of a passion he had kept chained for centuries. He tasted of night, of power, and of a profound, heartbreaking loneliness. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathless. The darkness no longer felt threatening, it felt intimate. "It was a mistake to mock you, Librarian," he breathed, his forehead resting against hers. "I was a fool." It was the closest he would ever come to an apology, and it was more than enough. The final piece of the puzzle was hidden not in a grand library or a secret catacomb, but in Ilara's own past. A children's book her grandmother used to read to her, a collection of folk tales from the old country. One of the stories, a fable about a clever girl who hides a star from a shadow king, contained a cipher in its illustrations. It was a code her bloodline had passed down for generations, hidden in plain sight. Her ancestors were not just scholars, they were the designated guardians of the Codex Nocturnus. Their shyness, their inconspicuous nature, it was all a form of camouflage, a legacy of hiding. Ilara was the final link in that chain, the last living guardian. The Codex was not in some forgotten vault across Europe. It had been in London all along. The revelation was a double-edged sword. It gave them the location, but it also cast a dark shadow over their burgeoning relationship. "So it was never a coincidence," Alistair said, his voice dangerously quiet. They were back in his study at the manor, the children's book open on the desk between them. "Fate didn't choose you for me at random. You were always the key. Your bloodline, your purpose, it was all leading to this." Ilara flinched as if struck. The warmth that had grown between them in Prague had turned to ice. She could see the suspicion in his eyes, the return of the cold, paranoid lord she had first met. "You think I knew?" she asked, her voice trembling with hurt. "You think my entire life has been some kind of elaborate ruse?" "Hasn't it?" he countered, his face a mask of cold fury. He felt betrayed, not by her, but by destiny itself. He had allowed himself to feel something, to believe this connection was a singular miracle, only to discover it was a piece of a pre-written prophecy. He felt like a puppet. Your family hid this for centuries, breeding generation after generation of quiet, unassuming librarians, waiting for my enemies to get close, waiting for me to appear. Tell me, Ilara, was any of it real? Your fear in that alley? Your brilliance in the archives? Or were you just the bait in a trap set 500 years ago? Each word was a dagger. The trust they had built, the kiss they had shared, it all crumbled to dust. She had just discovered her entire life was a legacy of duty and secrets, and the one person she had come to rely on, to care for, was now accusing her of the ultimate deception. "How dare you?" she whispered, her pain giving way to a white-hot anger she had never known she possessed. "I have lost everything. My home, my life, my anonymity. I have faced down assassins and monsters in the dark. I have given you everything I have, and you accuse me of this?" "The evidence is compelling," he said, his voice flat. "The evidence is that you are a coward, Lord Valerius," she shot back, her eyes flashing. "You are so terrified of the bond, so afraid of feeling anything genuine, that you would rather believe in a grand conspiracy than accept that a mousy librarian could ever be your equal, your fated mate." His face contorted in a snarl, his control snapping. He swept his arm across the desk, sending books and papers flying. "You know nothing of what I fear." "I know you're afraid of me," she cried, tears streaming down her face now, "and you always have been." The accusation hung in the air between them, undeniable and devastating. He couldn't refute it. His cruelty, his distance, his suspicion, it had all been a shield. His rage and paranoia won. He saw her not as his mate, but as the linchpin of a destiny he couldn't control. "I will retrieve the codex," he said, his voice like chips of ice. "Alone. Your part in this is over." He turned and strode to the door. "You will remain in your rooms until I am done. I will not have the key wandering about freely." He locked her in. The heavy thud of the bolt sliding into place was the sound of her heart breaking. She was his prisoner again, but this time it was infinitely worse. Before, he had been a stranger, a monster. Now, he was the man who had kissed her in the dark, the man she had foolishly started to trust. She sank to the floor, alone in her gilded cage, the taste of betrayal bitter in her mouth. This was her lowest point, abandoned by the one person fate had decreed was hers. For 2 days, Ilara remained locked in her suite, a prisoner of Alistair's fear. She alternated between furious anger and profound despair. The bond was a torment, a constant link to the man who had rejected her. She felt his cold resolve, his simmering fury, and beneath it all, a deep, aching chasm of loneliness that mirrored her own. He was preparing to face Malachi, to retrieve the codex, and he was doing it alone, convinced she was a liability, a deception. Meanwhile, Alistair was consumed by his own private hell. He pored over the cipher from Ilara's book, mapping out the final location, a hidden vault beneath a decommissioned tube station in the heart of the city. But his focus was shattered. Every rustle of paper, every shadow in the corner of his eye reminded him of her. He could feel her sorrow through the bond, a constant dull ache behind his ribs. It was a distraction he couldn't afford, yet one he couldn't escape. The turning point came from an unexpected source. It was an old ghoul named Silas, the manor's groundskeeper and Alistair's confidant for the last 2 centuries. He entered the study without knocking, his wizened face set in lines of disapproval. "You are a fool, my lord," Silas said, his voice like gravel. Alistair looked up from his maps, his eyes glowing with irritation. "You forget your place." "And you forget yours," the ghoul retorted, unafraid. "Your place is by her side. You feel it. The bond weakens when you are apart and in conflict. You are going into the most important battle of your existence at half strength because your pride is wounded." "It is not my pride, it is strategy," Alistair snapped. "You call this strategy?" Silas gestured around the chaotic study, locking away your greatest asset, hurling accusations at the one person destined to be your strength. "Malachi is not a fool. He fights with his coven, his allies. You intend to face him alone, nursing a broken heart like a lovelorn poet. You are not just a fool, you are an arrogant one." The ghoul's words struck home with the force of a physical blow because they were true. Alistair's rage wasn't strategic. It was a childish, terrified reaction. He had been so afraid of being manipulated by fate that he had willingly chosen the path of self-destruction. He had pushed Ilara away, not because she was a threat, but because his feelings for her were. Trusting her felt like a greater risk than facing Malachi and his entire coven alone. And that was the ultimate cowardice. He looked at the door to the hall, the path to her rooms. The choice was clear. He could continue on this path and likely die, taking London with him if Malachi unleashed the primordial. Or he could swallow his pride, confront his fear, and trust his mate. He found her standing by the window, staring out at the rain-streaked glass. She didn't turn when he entered. The heavy lock sliding open had been announcement enough. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't justify his actions. He offered her the one thing he had never given anyone, his vulnerability. "I was wrong," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual arrogance. "What I said to you, it was born of fear. Not of you, but of this." He gestured between them. "For centuries, my strength has been my solitude. To need someone, to be bound to them, it feels like a weakness. And the idea that it was not a choice, but a design, enraged me." Ilara slowly turned to face him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but clear, her expression guarded. "You hurt me," she said simply. "I know," he acknowledged, "and I cannot undo it. I can only tell you that the greatest fool in this house is not the librarian, but its master." He took a step closer, his hands open at his sides. "Silas called me arrogant. He was right. I thought I could do this alone. I can't. Malachi will be waiting. He will have his entire coven. To face him, I don't just need the key. I need the guardian." He looked her in the eyes, his own twilight gaze filled with a raw, desperate plea. "I need my partner. I need you, Ilara." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. He was laying his soul bare, admitting his fear, his need. He was offering her not a command, but a choice, a true alliance. She searched his face, seeing the cracks in his immortal facade, the lonely man beneath the powerful lord. Her anger receded, replaced by a wave of empathy. They were both prisoners of this destiny, and fighting each other was a luxury they couldn't afford. More than that, she didn't want to fight him. "Okay, Alistair," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Partners, but on my terms." A shadow of a smile touched his lips. "I would expect nothing less." They spent the next few hours planning, not as master and servant, but as equals. Her knowledge of history and architecture complemented his centuries of strategic warfare. The vault was protected by more than just locks. It was warded with ancient spells tied to riddles. Riddles only someone with her specific knowledge could solve. His role was to get her there, to hold off Malachi's forces while she worked. They stood before the entrance to the abandoned Aldwych station, the air thick with the smell of ozone and damp earth. "Ready?" he asked, his hand hovering near hers. "No," she said with a shaky laugh, "but let's do it anyway." He allowed himself a genuine, small smile, and for a moment they were just a man and a woman standing before a doorway to darkness. He took her hand, his cold fingers lacing through her warm ones. The bond flared between them, no longer a source of conflict, but a circuit of shared strength. The confrontation was immediate. As they descended into the tiled depths of the station, shadows detached from the walls. Lord Malachi stood on the far platform, a cruel smile on his pale, handsome face. He was flanked by a dozen vampires of his coven, their eyes glowing red in the gloom. "Valerius," Malachi called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous space, "and you brought the little bookworm." "How thoughtful! You've saved me the trouble of finding her." "Your trouble is just beginning, Malachi," Alistair snarled, pulling Alara behind him as he drew a long, silver-inlaid saber from a concealed sheath inside his coat. "Give me the girl and the codex, and I will grant you a quick end." "The girl is with me," Alistair stated, his voice ringing with absolute possession and promise, "and you will never have her." With a roar, the Coven of the Thorn charged. The battle began. It was a whirlwind of motion and violence. Alistair was a tempest, his blade a blur of silver light, his movements impossibly fast. He fought with the fury of a cornered god, a stark contrast to the cold, controlled warrior who had dispatched the hunters. This was personal. He was not just defending his legacy, he was defending his mate. "The door, Ilara! Go!" he yelled, parrying a strike that would have decapitated a mortal man. Ilara ran, her heart pounding in her ears. She raced toward the maintenance tunnel described in the cipher, the sounds of the vicious battle fading behind her. She found the iron door, rusted and ancient. On it was a series of concentric rings with carved symbols, the first riddle. She worked frantically, her mind a flurry of historical dates and astronomical alignments. As she solved each puzzle, the sounds of the fight grew more desperate. She could feel Alistair's stamina beginning to wane through the bond. He was powerful, but he was outnumbered. She felt a sharp, searing pain in her own side as a blade grazed his ribs. She cried out, doubling over for a second before forcing herself back to the task. She had to hurry. Finally, with a groan of ancient metal, the door swung open, revealing a dark, descending staircase. The air that wafted up was cold and smelled of deep earth and powerful magic. This was it, the vault. At the bottom of the stairs was a simple stone pedestal. Resting upon it was a large book bound in what looked like blackened human skin, clasped shut with iron. The Codex Nocturnus. As her fingers brushed against its cover, a wave of power washed over her, and she heard a voice in her mind, a chorus of her ancestors. "The Guardian has come. The bond is complete." At that same moment, a terrible silence fell over the station above. She grabbed the heavy codex and ran back up the stairs, her heart filled with dread. The scene on the platform was one of carnage. Malachi's vampires lay broken and dissolving into dust. But Alistair was on one knee, panting, his saber lying on the ground just out of reach. Malachi stood over him, a triumphant sneer on his face, holding a long, cruelly barbed stake carved from hawthorn wood. "It seems your little librarian has succeeded," Malachi said, his eyes flicking to Alara and the codex in her arms. "Excellent. Now you get to watch me kill her, and then I will use that book to unleash our glorious ancestor and remake this world." "You will not touch her," Alistair growled, trying to rise, but he was too wounded, too exhausted. Malachi laughed and started walking toward Ilara. And who is going to stop me? Him? Ilara's mind raced. Alistair was defeated. She was just a human. But she was the Guardian. The codex in her arms felt strangely warm, humming with dormant power. The bond is complete, the voices had said. She said, her voice ringing out with an authority she didn't know she possessed. Malachi paused, amused. You, little mouse? She looked down at the book, then at Alistair, and finally at the approaching vampire. She knew what she had to do. It wasn't a spell she read, but a truth she suddenly understood. The Codex was a prison, and its power could be commanded, but it required a sacrifice, a trade. You want to unleash the primordial in this book, she said, holding the Codex up. Then you must take its place. She opened the book. Instead of pages, it was a swirling vortex of shadow and screaming faces. It pulled at the air, at the light. Malachi stumbled back, his eyes wide with horror as he realized what she was doing. He had wanted to control it, not be consumed by it. "No!" he shrieked, lunging for her. Ilara stood her ground. She focused all her will, all her fear, all her newfound strength, and the power of her bloodline, her guardianship, into a single command. She poured the strength of the mate bond into it, using her connection to Alistair as an anchor. Take him! The vortex of shadow surged from the book, forming ethereal tendrils that shot across the platform. They bypassed her completely, wrapping around Malachi, whose screams became muffled as the darkness enveloped him. He was lifted from his feet, struggling futilely as the shadows dragged him, inexorably, toward the open codex. With a final, soul-wrenching cry, he was pulled into the book. The vortex imploded, the pages slammed shut with a deafening boom, and the clasp sealed itself with a flash of purple light. The codex fell from her hands, clattering to the ground, once again an inert, ancient book. Silence. Ilara swayed on her feet, the effort having drained her completely. Alistair was already moving. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring his wounds, and crossed the platform in 2 strides, catching her as her legs gave way. He held her tightly, his face buried in her hair, breathing in her scent as if it were air itself. He was shaking. The invincible Lord Valerius was shaking. "You did it," he whispered in awe. "Ilara, you did it." She leaned against him, her body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. "We did it," she corrected him softly. "Partners." He pulled back just enough to look at her face. His eyes, usually so cold and guarded, were filled with an emotion she had never seen there before. Pure, unadulterated love. He gently brushed the hair from her face, his touch reverent. The battle was over. The threat was neutralized. The primordial was secure, and its would-be master was now its prisoner. They stood there for a long moment amidst the dust of his vanquished enemies, 2 souls from different worlds, bound by a fate they had first cursed and now had claimed as their own. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, neither of them had to face it alone. In the aftermath, they did not return to the oppressive splendor of Valerius Manor. Instead, Alistair took her back to the Athenaeum Club library. It was after midnight, and the grand reading room was empty, silent save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. The air smelled of beeswax and paper, her scent, her world. Alistair stood by the towering shelves, the moonlight from the Palladian windows silvering his dark hair. The wounds from his battle were already healing, leaving his tailored suit looking deceptively pristine. He had recovered the Codex Nocturnus from the station platform, and now he held it in his hands. "This belongs to your family," he said, his voice quiet in the vast room. "It is your burden to carry, if you still choose it." Ilara looked at the book, the source of all her terror and all her strength. Her life as a guardian was not something she could simply set aside, but the terms of that life had changed. "And what of you?" she asked. "Your enemies are gone. You have no more need of a key or a guardian." He walked toward her, stopping just before her. He didn't offer the codex. Instead, he set it down on a nearby table, dismissing it. His focus was entirely on her. "I have no more need of a key," he agreed, his voice a low murmur. "But I find myself in desperate need of a librarian." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw. "The bond is no longer a chain, Ilara. It is simply a fact. What we do with it, that is a choice. Our choice." He was offering her an out. She could take the codex, resume her life of quiet guardianship, and he would let her go. He would protect her from afar, a silent, unseen shadow, and they would both live with the ache of the broken bond for the rest of their days. Or she could choose him. She looked around the library, at the silent, sleeping books that had been her only companions for so long. They were her past. Alistair, with his darkness and his danger and his surprising, fierce heart, was her future. She knew it with a certainty that settled deep in her bones. Ilara didn't answer him with words. She turned away from him and walked over to a rolling ladder leaning against a bookshelf. She climbed a few rungs, her fingers trailing along the spines of worn leather books until she found the one she was looking for. A slim volume of poetry she had always loved. She pulled it from the shelf, sat down on the step, and opened it to a bookmarked page. Alistair watched her, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face for the very first time. He didn't press for an answer. He simply leaned against a towering bookshelf, crossing his arms, content to wait. The great Lord Valerius, who had commanded armies and toppled empires, was now waiting patiently for a shy librarian to finish her page. The new beginning was not a grand declaration or a passionate kiss. It was a quiet, shared moment in a room full of stories, the silent understanding that their own story was just beginning.